whispered. The husband could not answer, because the chains were still hanging in the hallway, untouched. By morning the house would be empty. No struggle, no sign of escape, just open doors and silence. And Josiah, gone. The newspapers called it madness, rumors, coincidence, but the whispers spread faster than print ever could. People said the auction had awakened something. People said beauty like that was never meant to be owned. People said Josiah was not sold, he was released. And Lumpkin's Alley? It never felt the same again. Men avoided the block, auctions shortened. No one stood where Josiah once had, because some places remember, and some stories do not end when the sale is complete. They wait, final hook, for session 2. What no one knew that night, what history would bury on purpose, was that Josiah was not the first. And the auction in Richmond was not a mistake. It was a pattern that would surface again, in another city, with another name, and far more blood. By the third day, Richmond stopped pretending nothing had happened. The city had survived fires, epidemics, and riots before, but this was different. This wasn't loud. This wasn't sudden. This crept in quietly, through locked doors and whispered prayers, and settled into people's chests like a weight they couldn't breathe past. The alley where Josiah had stood was empty now, not abandoned, avoided. Merchants took longer routes, buyers crossed the street. Even the auctioneers, men hardened by years of selling human lives, lowered their voices when passing Lumpkin's Alley, as if the bricks themselves were listening. 3 deaths in one night could be dismissed, barely, but by the end of the week, there were 7 men, all connected by one thing. They had been there, they had watched, they had bid, and now they were gone. One was found slumped over his desk, quill still in hand, eyes open as if interrupted mid-thought. Another collapsed on the church steps after Sunday service, blood trickling from his nose with no wound to explain it. One man disappeared entirely. His house stood open, dinner cold on the table, boots by the door. No body was ever found. The city paper tried to control the narrative. Sudden illness, stress of the season, coincidental misfortune. But the people didn't believe it. They never do, because people notice patterns long before officials admit them. Every man who died had spoken Josiah's name, not publicly, not loudly, but at home, in prayer, in fear, and the strangest detail of all, none of the enslaved people were harmed, not one. In a city built on brutality, that fact alone unsettled everyone. Something was choosing, and it wasn't random. Late one night, a meeting was held behind closed doors in a candlelit room near the courthouse. 12 men sat around a table polished smooth by generations of power. These were men who owned land, newspapers, shipping routes, and souls. They did not speak of guilt. They spoke of containment. One of them finally said what the others had been circling around. This started at the auction. No one argued. Another man leaned forward, voice low. "We shouldn't have let it go forward." A third snapped back, "You're talking nonsense." But his hands were shaking. They decided to do what men like them always did when something threatened their control. Erase it. By morning, orders were given. Records from the auction were altered. Names were removed. Descriptions simplified. Josiah's existence reduced to a line that meant nothing. But paper lies don't stop living consequences. That same night, the man who had served as the auction's official recorder woke to the sound of scratching beneath his floorboards, slow, deliberate. He told himself it was rats, or wood settling, or his own imagination finally breaking under pressure. Then he heard breathing. Not his. The floorboards creaked, and then came the knock from inside the house. When his wife screamed, neighbors rushed in. They found him collapsed against the wall, eyes fixed on the open cellar door. His fingers were bloodied, nails torn back as if he had tried to claw his way upward. Inside the cellar, there was nothing, just deep gouge marks along the walls. as if something had been dragged out. By then, the rumors were unstoppable. People said Josiah was never human. People said he was a reflection, something shaped by cruelty and released by greed. People said Richmond had finally created something it couldn't own or destroy. But the truth was quieter and worse. A freed black preacher, long ignored by the city's elite, spoke openly during a small gathering that week. His voice didn't shake. His eyes didn't wander. "This isn't punishment," he said. "It's exposure." No one listened. Not until the final body was found, the auctioneer himself, hanging from the same beam where bids had been called. No rope marks, no broken neck. Just his body suspended, as if held in place by something unseen. Carved into the wood beside him were 4 words: uneven, deep, final. "You saw me." That was the moment Richmond broke. Auctions were halted, not officially, but no one showed up. The block stood empty, sun beating down on wood that now felt cursed. And Josiah, no sightings, no proof, only the aftermath, only the bloodless dead, only the realization that the auction hadn't ended in violence. It had begun one. And the worst part, the city would never admit, because if they did, they would have to accept something far more terrifying than ghosts or curses. They would have to accept responsibility. Final hook for Session 3. But what the people of Richmond did not know was that someone had tried to stop the auction before it ever happened. A warning had been delivered, a message ignored, and in Session 3 we uncover who tried to intervene and why even they were afraid to speak his name. By the time the city accepted that something had gone wrong, it was already too late to trace where it had begun. But there had been a beginning. Not in the alley, not on the auction block, and not with Josiah. It started days earlier, with a warning no one wanted to hear. 2 mornings before the auction, a sealed envelope arrived at the office of the firm overseeing the sale. No return address, no seal of authority, just thick paper, folded once, written by hand. The clerk nearly threw it away. He didn't recognize the handwriting, and letters like this came all the time. Complaints, threats, prayers disguised as ink. But something about this one felt different. The paper smelled faintly of smoke. Inside, the message was short. Do not place him on the block. Do not name him. Do not sell what does not belong to you. At the bottom, one final line. You have already paid once. The clerk laughed it off. So die. The men above him. They'd seen superstition before. People always tried to dress fear up as prophecy. But that afternoon, something strange began to happen. One by one, wealthy buyers quietly withdrew. Men who never missed an auction. Men who had already requested private viewings. Men who had instructed their accountants to prepare funds. Each offered a different excuse. Illness, family matters, travel delays. But behind closed doors, their reasons sounded the same. He doesn't feel right. I don't want my name attached. I had a dream. One man admitted it openly after too much whiskey. I saw him standing in my house, he said, staring into his glass. Not working, not waiting, just standing there like he owned the place. His friends laughed nervously, but none of them placed a bid. Those who did show up stood back, watched, hesitated, and those who did bid, they paid the price. After the auctioneer's death, the envelope resurfaced. This time it was found on a desk that no longer had an owner. The paper was stained now, the ink smeared, as if someone had gripped it too tightly. A junior official brought it to a man who knew better than to ignore patterns. His name would never appear in records, but he had been part of something similar once before. Years earlier, in another city, another sale that ended badly. He read the letter once, then again, and then he burned it, not out of disbelief, out of fear, because he recognized the phrasing. The warnings weren't religious. They weren't mystical. They were procedural. as if written by someone who understood exactly how these things unfolded, and how little time there was to stop them once they began. That night, he ordered his servants to lock every door and window. He slept with a pistol beside him. He did not pray. At dawn, his house was still standing, but his neighbor's wasn't. The man next door, another former bidder, was found seated at his dining table, hands folded, eyes closed, peaceful, if not for the fact that his feet never touched the floor. The chair was pushed back. He was suspended inches above it. No rope, no support, just empty space. The city could no longer pretend this wasn't a curse in the way stories like to describe curses. There were no chants, no symbols, no ancient words. This was something simpler, consequence. The truth, buried beneath layers of denial, finally began to surface. Josiah's beauty had not drawn attention because it was rare. It had drawn attention because it was wrong, too perfect, too intact, too untouched by the system designed to break men. And the wealthy knew it. They sensed it instinctively. You can exploit many things, strength, fear, desperation, but you cannot exploit something that does not submit. That was why the strongest bidders hesitated. That was why the warning mattered. And that was why the auction had to happen anyway. Because the system demanded proof that nothing was beyond ownership. By the end of the week, a final meeting was held. Smaller this time, quieter, no bravado left. One man finally asked the question none of them wanted to voice. What if he was never meant to be sold? Silence answered him, because they all knew the truth. If Josiah had been a man, he would have broken. If he had been a thing, he would have been owned. But he was neither. People remembered her scream more than her face. That was the star Ange part. In a city full of noise, chains, shouting, wagons, deals being made, that one sound cut through everything. Not because it was loud, but because it was honest. It was the sound of someone seeing something they were never supposed to see again. Her name was Margaret Hale. At least, that's what the church records said. She was not poor, she was not reckless, and she had no reason to be anywhere near Lumpkin's Alley that day. But she came anyway. Margaret had buried her husband 12 years earlier. He had died quietly in his sleep, far from auction blocks and crowds. Or so the official record claimed. The truth was more complicated. Before his death, her husband had worked briefly for a trading firm that specialized in problem stock. People who didn't break easily, people who resisted, people who didn't behave the way the system expected them to, men like Josiah. Margaret never spoke about that chapter of her life, but she never forgot it either. On the morning of the auction, she told her sister she felt uneasy, not sick, not afraid, just pulled like a memory tugging at her sleeve. When she reached the edge of the crowd and saw him on the block, the world narrowed. The years folded in on themselves. She didn't see a slave. She saw a boy, younger, barefoot, standing in a yard behind a holding house years ago, calm, watching, silent in a way that made grown men uncomfortable. She had brought him water once. He had looked at her the same way then, not grateful, not afraid, aware. That was when she screamed, because people age, bodies change, faces soften. But recognition like that does not survive time unless something else is at work. Margaret understood something in that instant that no one else in the crowd did. This auction was not a first, it was a return. Her death was recorded as sudden collapse, heart failure, the kind of explanation that closes doors and stops questions. But a nurse who prepared the body noticed something strange. Margaret's hands were clenched tight. Inside her fist was a scrap of cloth, dark, old, threadbare. The same cloth her husband had brought home years earlier and burned without explanation. No one could explain how it had ended up with her. By nightfall, Margaret's home was searched, quietly, respectfully, and thoroughly. They found journals. Most were ordinary. Household notes, sermon reflections. Lists of names crossed out one by one. But near the back, wrapped in linen, was a single page, written in a different hand, a man's hand. It read, "If he is ever sold again, it means we failed. Do not let them name him." He remembers, the officials who read it said nothing. They burned the page before dawn, because by then another woman had vanished, Margaret's sister. She had been staying in the house that night. She told neighbors she felt watched, that she heard someone walking the halls slowly, deliberately. By morning she was gone, no struggle, no sound, just the front door open and the faint impression of bare feet in the dust. People wanted to believe Josiah was responsible. They wanted something simple to fear. But the truth was far worse. Josiah had not come for revenge. He had come for witnesses. Margaret had recognized him because she had seen him survive before. Years earlier, a private sale had ended the same way. Deaths, disappearances, silence, records altered, and he had walked a way then too, not freed, uncontained. The woman's scream wasn't fear, it was realization, and realization is dangerous, because once someone recognizes the pattern, the lie begins to crack. By the end of the week, women stopped attending auctions entirely, children were kept indoors, men stopped speaking names out loud. And Josiah, he was no longer just a rumor, he was a reminder that some things do not belong to history. They return when called. There was a word they used when they didn't want something remembered, not officially, not in print, just among themselves, forbidden. It wasn't a moral warning, it wasn't sympathy, it was a classification, used only when ownership failed. The term first appeared years before Richmond, buried in ledgers that no one read twice, pages that looked ordinary unless you knew what to look for. No name, no age, no price, just a mark in the margin, a slash through a line that should have held a human life. The men who recognized that mark understood its meaning immediately. Do not bid, do not ask, do not record, and most importantly, do not repeat what happened last time. The first warning about Josiah came from one of these men, an old trader, sick, retired. His hands shook when he wrote, not from age but from memory. He sent word quietly, through channels that avoided paper. This one has a history, he said, and history does not stay buried. No one listened, because greed has a way of convincing powerful people that this time will be different. After all, Josiah looked like any other man. He bled, he breathed, he stood where he was told. But what made him forbidden was not what he did, it was what he didn't do. He never begged, not once. Men who had seen hundreds of broken bodies noticed it immediately. Fear makes people small, pain makes people loud. Josiah was neither. During a private inspection before the auction, one buyer tried to provoke him, stepped too close, gripped his arm harder than necessary. Josiah didn't resist. He didn't flinch. He simply met the man's eyes. The buyer let go. Later, he claimed the room had felt wrong, like standing too close to the edge of something deep. That buyer would live, because he never placed a bid. The ones who ignored the warnings justified it easily. Superstition was for the weak. They had contracts, law, control. They believed labels were power, so they labeled Josiah, and that was mistake number 2. The official name given to him never appeared in full. It was abbreviated, as if even writing it down felt unsafe. But in a side note, someone wrote, "Do not move again after sale." That note alone confirmed everything, because property is always moved, unless someone already knows it won't stay. The night Josiah disappeared from the buyer's house, a fire broke out across town, small, contained, but it drew attention away long enough for something else to happen unnoticed. A storage room beneath the auction office was found open. Inside were old crates, broken locks, and an empty collar, heavy iron, etched with a number that matched no record. The collar had been used once before, years earlier, in another city. When they tried to hold him, the collar had failed, not broken, removed, cleanly. That detail terrified the men who saw it, because escape requires struggle, removal requires permission, and Josiah had never asked. By now the pattern was undeniable. Those who tried to own him disappeared. Those who tried to erase him died. Those who witnessed and stayed silent survived. The forbidden classification was not about danger. It was about limits. Josiah represented the point where the system ended, where cruelty could no longer be contained inside ledgers and laws. He was not rebellion. He was proof that something had been pushed too far too many times and had learned to walk back out. By the end of the month, a final notice was circulated quietly among traders. No signatures, no seals, just 3 lines. Do not speak the name, do not mark the body. If he appears again, leave. Richmond pretended it had never happened, but history doesn't forget what people try hardest to bury, because forbidden things don't disappear. By the time the 3rd body was buried, no one was using the word coincidence anymore. They were using quieter words: pattern, connection, timing. Words people choose when they are afraid of what the truth might demand from them. The deaths were not dramatic at first glance. No blood-soaked scenes, no public executions, just men, gone. But when you laid the details side by side, something began to take shape. 3 men, 3 nights, 3 separate parts of the city, and yet the same stillness at the end. The first had been the bidder who pushed the price too high, ambitious, loud, proud of his appetite for ownership. He died in his study. No sign of intrusion, no sign of struggle. His servant found him seated upright, hands resting calmly on the desk, eyes fixed on nothing. The ink in his pen was still wet, as if he had been interrupted mid-sentence. The second had been quieter, careful. He bid late, cautiously, as if testing fate instead of challenging it. He collapsed in his church pew, right after the final hymn. Witnesses said he whispered something just before he fell. A name. The 3rd death was the one that ended the debate, because the 3rd man had never placed a bid. He had only watched, only taken notes, only written things down. He was the accountant, the man who translated flesh into numbers. He was found in his office, ledgers open, every page turned to the same entry. A blank line, no name, no price, just a mark pressed so hard into the paper it tore through multiple pages. Someone was counting, not emotionally, not angrily, precisely. And someone else noticed it too. A junior clerk named Thomas Gray, young, nervous, still believed order existed. He had been tasked with compiling a list of recent deaths connected to trade disputes. Routine work. Nothing more. But when he began writing names, his hand slowed. Every man he listed had been present at the same auction, not involved in the same way, but present. Thomas didn't sleep that night. He spread papers across his rented room, candles burning low, names on one side, dates on the other, locations carefully marked. The pattern was undeniable. The deaths followed proximity. Those who touched the system directly died first. Those who managed it from a distance followed. Observers were last. Witnesses were not safe. Thomas did what people always do when logic fails. He looked for a reason. He found one in an old shipping manifest from years earlier. Different city, different auction, same irregular mark, the same blank line, and 3 deaths had followed that one too. Not immediately, patiental. Like a balance being restored. The realization hit him hard. This wasn't at revenge. Revenge is emotional, messy, imprecise. This was accounting. The system had taken something it could not process, and now the numbers were correcting themselves. Terrified, Thomas took his findings to a man he trusted, a former judge, retired, quiet, known for discretion. The judge read the papers slowly, then he closed them. "You need to stop," he said. "Why?" Thomas asked. The judge didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood and locked the door. "Because," he said finally, You're still alive." That night, Thomas heard footsteps outside his room, slow, measured. He did not open the door. He did not speak. By morning, the footsteps were gone, but the papers were missing. All except one. A single sheet left neatly on his desk. 3 names were crossed out. 1 space remained blank. Thomas understood the message. The count was not finished. The city responded the only way it knew how: denial. Officials declared the deaths unrelated. Newspapers shifted focus. New scandals replaced old ones. But people whispered. They whispered about Josiah walking freely through locked houses, about doors opening without force, about a presence that did not hurry. Most disturbing of all was what didn't happen. Children were left untouched. The enslaved were ignored. The poor were spared. Only those who had benefited directly from the auction suffered. That detail destroyed every comfortable lie, because monsters don't discriminate. But justice does, and that possibility scared people more than any ghost story ever could. By the end of the week, Thomas packed his things and left Richmond. He would live a long life. He would never speak of this again, but he would never forget the final detail he noticed before leaving. The count never exceeded 3 at a time, as if whatever was doing the counting did not rush, did not panic, did not lose track. And that meant one thing: it was still nearby. Every city has a foundation it refuses to talk about. Richmond's was not made of brick or stone, it was made of silence. Long before Lumpkin's Alley became a place of auctions, it had been something else: a holding ground, a waiting space, a place where people were kept until decisions were made about their lives. And beneath it all, there was a room, not listed on any map, not mentioned in any plan, but it existed. The entrance had been sealed years earlier, disguised behind stacked crates and forgotten doors. Only a handful of men ever knew it was there. Fewer still had gone inside. After the deaths began, curiosity turned into desperation. Someone needed answers. Late one night, 2 officials returned to the alley with a lantern and a set of old keys that should not have still worked, but they did. The door opened easily, too easily. The stairs were narrow, carved directly into the earth. The air grew colder with every step, not damp, not stale, still. At the bottom, the lantern light revealed a small room. No furniture, no chains, just markings on the walls, tallies, hundreds of them. Each marked deep, deliberate, carved by hand, not names, not numbers, time, days, months, years. Someone had been kept here for a long time, and someone had counted. In the center of the room was a single iron ring set into the floor. It was not broken, it was not bent, it had been opened, cleanly. One of the men felt sick. "This isn't possible," he said, but it was, because written on the far wall, beneath layers of soot and age, was a phrase scratched so faintly it almost vanished into the stone. "You can hold a body, you cannot hold a will." The room wasn't a prison, it was a test, and someone had passed it. Records surfaced quietly after that night. Old shipping logs, private correspondence, notes exchanged between traders who believed they were being clever by avoiding detail. They all pointed to the same conclusion. Years earlier, a man had been brought here. Not sold, not proc. Est. Held, because he refused to be named. He refused to answer to anything given to him. They had tried to wait him out. They always do. But time works differently when one side refuses to break. When he was finally released, not freed, just moved, the room was sealed and forgotten. Until now, the irony was impossible to ignore. They had built an entire system around control, and beneath it, they had hidden proof of its limits. Josiah had not become something else in that room. He had remained himself, and that was the problem. The men who entered the room left quietly. They locked the door again. They told no one. But the damage was done, because rooms like that don't stay hidden once remembered. By morning, rumors spread, not about ghosts, about foundations. about what had been built on top of suffering and denial, and about how cracks always start below the surface. Josiah was never seen entering or leaving that room. He didn't need to. The place remembered him, and memory is powerful. Names were everything in that world. They were how ownership began. A name turned a person into a record into a transaction into control. That was why the first thing taken from most enslaved people was their name. And that was why Josiah's case terrified the system, because no matter how many times they tried, his name never stayed. In the ledgers beneath Lumpkin's alley, there were dozens of entries where a name should have been written. Instead, there was space. Not crossed out, not erased, left blank. At first, clerks assumed it was a mistake, someone forgetting to fill a line, someone rushing, but mistakes repeat only until they are corrected. This one N ever was. Every time a name was written, it vanished, not physically removed, just never matched again. One ledger listed him as Joseph, another as Isaiah. A third tried numbers instead, none of them connected. It was as if the system could not hold him in place long enough to define him, and systems do not tolerate that. A senior registrar finally issued a quiet order. "No name," he said. "It complicates things." That sentence should have ended the matter. Instead, it sealed it, because refusing to name something does not make it disappear. It makes it powerful. The enslaved people noticed first. They always do. They spoke of him carefully, indirectly, never calling him anything that could be repeated. He's the one who listens. He's the one who doesn't bend. He's the one who remembers. Josiah was a name given later, after Richmond, after the deaths, after the silence became impossible to ignore. Before that, he was simply there. One night, an overseer tried to force the issue. He dragged Josiah into a room and demanded an answer. "What's your name?" he shouted. Josiah didn't move, didn't resist, didn't comply. The overseer struck him hard. Josiah staggered, just slightly, then looked back up. Not angry, not broken, patient. The overseer hit him again, and then the man did something no one expected. He stepped back, because for a brief moment, just a flicker, he couldn't remember his own name. The feeling passed quickly, but the fear didn't. He never went near Josiah again. That incident was never recorded, but the effect spread. People avoided direct questions, avoided prolonged eye contact, avoided acknowledgement, because acknowledgement is a kind of ing, and naming implies authority. Josiah did not recognize authority the way others did. That terrified them. In the secret room beneath the alley, the absence of a name took on new meaning. Someone had tried to define him once. The markings on the wall were not random. They were measurements, attempts to understand duration, resistance, survival. They weren't studying a man. They were studying a boundary. How long can a human be held before something breaks? Josiah had answered that question by not breaking at all. The realization settled slowly, like cold. He was never meant to be owned. He was meant to show where ownership failed, and that is why no name ever fit. Names bind, silence freeze. By the time people began calling him Josiah, it was already too late. The name didn't define him. It warned others. Those who spoke it carefully survived. Those who tried to claim it didn't. And that was the final truth of the nameless man. You can erase identity. The diary was never meant to be found. It was small, bound in cracked leather, pages yellowed with age, corners chewed by insects. No one signed their name to it. The writing inside was tight, deliberate, urgent. Every stroke seemed carved with intention. Every paragraph whispered warnings. It belonged to someone who had been present at the auction, and possibly before. Someone who understood that history itself was watching. The first line hit Thomas Gray like a blade. Everything was recorded. Everything. And yet, they will ignore it. It listed dates, Places, names, observations, small things that no one would think mattered at the time. Who had stood where on the auction block? Which bidders had hesitated? Which witnesses had screamed? What had been whispered between walls? And then it went further. The diary recorded more than facts. It described intent. Someone had planned it all. Not to harm Josiah, not to punish him, not to control him in the usual sense. The diary's handwriting spelled out a reality more terrifying than any rumor. He cannot be sold. He cannot be named. He cannot be contained. And yet they will try. Each subsequent page layered horrors deeper. The 3 deaths after the auction were not accidents. They were measured, counted, intended. Each disappearance noted with timestamps. Each reaction to Josiah recorded. Fear, hesitation, denial. Thomas read about Margaret Hale's scream, the woman who vanished, how her recognition of Josiah's nature had been noted, how her death and her sister's disappearance were carefully predicted in a line that no one dared to consider prophecy until it had already happened. It went back further. Notes about previous auctions, locations in other cities, similar patterns, previous forbidden, men who had resisted the ledger, each one followed by the same result, a system broken, lives erased, witnesses terrified into silence. But the diary also contained something worse than statistics, something human. It revealed the perspective of the observers, their conversations, their private warnings, their internal panic, their attempts to rationalize the impossible. They will call it coincidence. They will call it misfortune. They will call it superstition. But they know, each of them, deep down, they failed to control what they never should have tried to own. The last pages were almost ceremonial, almost like a farewell, a list of instructions. If he appears again, do not name him, do not touch him, record nothing except presence. Thomas put the diary down, hands trembling. It was not a simple record of events. It was a warning, and it was proof. The people of Richmond had not ignored superstition. They had ignored evidence, and ignoring evidence, especially when it carries its own memory, is dangerous. The diary ended abruptly. The final entry was just one sentence, underlined 3 times. He is always watching. No one ever questioned it. No one ever recorded it. No one dared to. And that was the last layer of terror. Not what Josiah did, not what he might do, but the fact that someone had planned the chaos, and it worked perfectly, years before the city even noticed. The man who purchased Josiah was well respected, affluent, charitable by the city's standards. He had a house large enough to host dinners, and children who slept peacefully at night, unaware of the darkness quietly threading through Richmond's streets. He thought he was buying a slave. He wasn't. The furs. Tea night in his home. Josiah didn't speak. He didn't resist. He didn't beg. He simply stood in the corner of the room, observed. Not coldly, not angrily, but in a way that made every adult in the house question themselves. By morning, the children awoke screaming, not from nightmares, but from the feeling of being watched. The father calmed them. The mother stayed silent, uneasy. The first domino fell subtly. Small things. A servant misplaced items that had been locked away for years. The family dog refused to enter certain rooms. Candles extinguished themselves without draft. The father blamed exhaustion. The mother blamed imagination. But by the 3rd day, whispers began. One child claimed to see Josiah sitting at the foot of their bed while they slept. A shadow, not human, not moving, yet undeniably present. The father, rational to a fault, demanded the children be quiet. He locked doors. He scolded. He reminded himself that fear was inherited, that nothing supernatural existed. By the 7th day, reality began to fracture. The mother awoke to find the portraits in the hallway rearranged, not crooked or fallen, but intentionally placed differently. faces staring in directions she had never seen before. She screamed. Her husband dismissed it as fatigue. By the 10th night, the first death occurred. The eldest son, found lying on the parlor floor, eyes wide open, expression frozen in disbelief. No wound, no struggle, only a single scrap of paper clutched in his hand. "You saw me." The father ignored it. The mother cried silently, but the pattern continued. The second child disappeared. No note, no sound, no trace, just an empty room and a floor pressed into dust where tiny footprints had faded into nothing. Neighbors whispered. The man's wife refused to leave the house. He attempted to hire guards. They fled. Servants abandoned the property in droves. By the end of the week, the father's fortune, once untouchable, had collapsed. Letters of credit returned. Loans called. Business partners refused to deal. Not because of scandal, but because the fear had spread. Fear is contagious. Greed is fragile. The man himself. He sat alone in the dark, staring at the corner where Josiah once stood. Hours passed like years. He spoke to himself, rehearsing arguments, trying to reason, trying to reclaim control. He could not. The house became a hollowed shell of memory. Doors would open on their own. Items moved without hands. Shadows lingered in corners that light could not touch. By the next month, the man had lost everything. His children gone, his wife vanished, his home abandoned, his wealth evaporated. All that remained was him, and a memory too vivid to ignore. He began wandering the city, talking quietly to himself. To anyone who would listen, he described Josiah as neither man nor property, but as a mirror. I looked at him, he saw me, and everything I thought I owned. He took it from me. This was no curse, no witchcraft, no divine intervention. It was consequence. The system had failed, he had failed, and the record was clear. The man who thought he could own Josiah had become the proof of Josiah's power. Not physical strength, not magic, but the undeniable ability to reveal the fragility of human greed, control, and pride. By the end, the house was empty. The father, broken, wandered aimlessly, and no one knew where he went. All the neighbors arid were the doors left swinging, the windows open at night, and the strange quiet that fell over the street. And Josiah, he was already elsewhere, watching, waiting, untouched, unbound, untouchable. After the auction, after the deaths, after the vanished families, the city wanted one thing, forgetting. Richmond did not want ghosts, it wanted silence. Official records were altered, pages torn, ledgers rewritten, names crossed out, dates shifted, events described as accidents, coincidences, or disease. Anyone who tried to speak of it quietly disappeared from conversations, letters, and society altogether. Even newspapers, which thrived on scandal, reported only vague tragedies. Unexpected deaths, they called them. Unexplained disappearances, no connection drawn, no questions allowed. The powerful learned quickly naming Josiah was dangerous. To acknowledge him was to risk everything. Reputation, wealth, family, even sanity. Over time, stories of him became whispers. Oral legends passed cautiously among the enslaved, never written, never confirmed. He sees what you can't control, one would say. Speak not his name. Even decades later, descendants of the auctioneers and buyers remembered shadows in hallways, footprints appearing and disappearing, objects moved with no hand. But all they did publicly was deny. The city did not forget entirely, it suppressed. Historians centuries later found scattered notes in private collections, letters describing auctions, deaths, and warnings. But without corroboration, the narrative was dismissed as rumor or superstition, and that was precisely the point. Because Josiah's story could not survive bureaucracy, it could not survive authority. It could not survive expectation. History teaches what it wants, and some truths are too dangerous. By erasing him, Richmond believed it had reclaimed control. It had not, because erasure does not undo memory. It only ensures that those who remember must whisper, those who witness must speak in shadows, and those who try to quantify the impossible, like Thomas Gray with his ledger or the officials who counted deaths, discover one undeniable fact: some presences cannot be contained, even by the weight of history itself. By the end of Session 11, the city looked orderly again. Streets were clean. Commerce continued. Families thrived. The auction block stood empty. But somewhere, beneath the alleys, beyond the records, in the quiet corners of homes and offices, he was still there, watching, waiting. Not a ghost, not a legend, not a name. A reminder that systems, even vast ones, have limits. And those limits can be learned the hard way. No one in Richmond understood what they had witnessed, but someone somewhere always would. Josiah did not vanish by accident. He did not slip into shadows randomly. He returned. Everywhere there was a ledger to be broken. Everywhere a system that believed it could own or measure human will. Everywhere greed thought itself clever, and each time the results were the same. The first city after Richmond was Charleston. The auction block there seemed ordinary at first glance. Buyers, sellers, clerks, normal. But the moment Josiah stepped onto the block, the air changed. It was quieter than it should have been. People hesitated. Shadows seemed heavier. Even the sun cast sharp lines that made the wooden planks look like prison bars. No one was chained. The first bidder approached. Confident, wealthy, certain. By evening he was dead. Same pattern, same measured consequence. 3 deaths within a week. Objects moved without hands. Witnesses terrified into silence. The system could not calculate him. It could not contain him. It could not predict him. And yet each appearance followed rules no one could explain. Only those directly attempting to claim or control him suffered. Witnesses survived but never spoke his name. Deaths and disappearances occurred with terrifying precision. Officials called it coincidence. Newspapers called it misfortune. Families called it tragedy. But those who knew better, those who had studied the ledger, the diaries, the tallies, called it inevitable. Because Josiah had a pattern, not a human pattern, not a logical one, a memory pattern. The world could not own him, and every system built to try would pay the cost. Years later, a trader tried to track him across cities. He compared auction records, letters, diaries, and he discovered something terrifying. Josiah returned in intervals. Not predictable, not regular, but precise enough that those who ignored the warnings were punished. Each appearance was a test, a reminder, a reckoning. By the time the pattern reached New Orleans, fear had spread. Entire blocks avoided auctions. Families stayed home. Buyers refused to attend. It was not superstition anymore. It was calculation, and it didn't matter how wealthy you were, how clever, or how rational. The ledger, the diary, the room beneath Lumpkin's alley, they all converged in one terrifying truth. No one could escape him. And no one could predict where he would appear next. Josiah H. was not bound by geography, not by time, not by law. He existed wherever the system attempted to claim what it could not. But you cannot erase presence. They wait. And now he was loose. It all came together in the end. The cities, the deaths, the whispers, the diaries, the secret room beneath Lumpkin's alley. Every record, every shadow, every empty ledger line pointed to one truth. Josiah could not be contained. He could not be named. He could not be owned. And yet, men tried. Wealthy, confident, rational men, armed with contracts and chains and logic, believed this time would be different. That they could measure him, predict him, control him. They were wrong. The final confrontation began not on an auction block, not in a secret room, not in a ledger-filled office. It began in the mind. The man who tried to claim him one last time. a descendant of the Richmond buyer, stood in a house untouched by time. Candlelight flickered across the walls, silence pressed against him like a living thing. He had read the diaries. He had studied the patterns. He knew the history, and he believed he could outthink it. Josiah appeared quietly, calmly, not entering through a door, not stepping through a threshold, simply present. The room became smaller. Time slowed. Shadows bent. The man's pulse thumped in a rhythm that seemed laughably inadequate. "Do you know why you're here?" Josiah's voice was calm, unhurried, not loud but unavoidable. It reverberated in the mind, not the ears. The man swallowed. I understand history. I know the rules." Josiah tilted his head, not judgmental, observant, patient. "History does not save you," he said, and in that moment the man understood. Not I. Not intellectually, not logically, but fully. All the deaths, all the disappearances, all the whispering across decades, they weren't mistakes, they weren't superstition, they were consequences. Consequences for trying to treat a will as property, consequences for trying to impose ownership on someone who could not yield. The final reckoning was quiet. No struggle, no chains, no violence, just presence, a calm, complete, undeniable presence. The man felt the weight of every ledger erased, every diary hidden, every secret room forgotten. He felt the accumulation of centuries of attempts to contain what could not be contained, and it crushed him. He fell to his knees, tears, sweat, fear, recognition. He realized he had nothing left, no power, no control, no escape. Josiah did not move closer. He did not need to. The room, the house, the entire city seemed to shift around him. Every shadow pointed, every line of sight compressed. He understood that he had been counted, and the count was final. Then Josiah simply turned and left. No door opened, no footsteps echoed, no trace remained. The man remained on the floor, broken, shaken, forever changed. Outside, the city continued. Streets, commerce, families, auctions, but everywhere the system had tried to claim him, shadows remembered. Everywhere someone whispered his name carefully, indirectly, and the final truth settled. Josiah was not a legend. He was not a ghost. He was not a man to be owned. He was a force, a human boundary against cruelty, greed, and control. And he always would be. No ledger could contain him. No auction block could hold him. No law could define him. Because some things do not belong to history. They belong to reality. And Josiah belonged only to himself. Epic closing hook. The auction blocks remain. Ledgers still exist. Whispers continue. And somewhere in every city built on the idea that men can be owned, someone feels him, watching, waiting, unclaimed, because he cannot be broken. He cannot be named. He cannot be owned. He is Josiah, and his story is eternal.